Thank you all for joining us today. We are Type Electives. We're an online design school shaping the future of type. We're co-founded by Lin Yun and myself, Juan Villanueva. In our Type Electives, we offer classes that go beyond traditional type design education, including lettering, type design, and creative technology. We work with faculty who bring respect, responsibility, criticality, and love to their practice, and we love working with students that are aligned in those values. So today is actually the last talk of our 4 lecture series, where we invite new and established voices to share their stories, knowledge, and ideas with the community. This season, we've been exploring supporting linguistic diversity through type design. So talking about language support, diacritic design, and language revitalization, everything in the context of typeface design. These are some of the amazing people that we've had throughout this series. And today we're wrapping up with Leo. So whether you're a type designer, academic, linguist, or just anything at all interested in letter forms and how language intersects with culture and technology, this lecture series is for you. Please share it with your friends. All the previous recordings or the previous talks have been uploaded to the Zoom. So you know, this one will also be recorded and we'll upload it to our website as soon as it's ready. And before we dive in, there's some ways you can help us. You can donate to our scholarship fund, which helps us, give scholarship seats to our students in our class. Subscribe to our newsletter for updates on classes and events. Follow us on social media, like and subscribe, and spread the word about our classes and events to your friends and colleagues or anyone that's interested in loves typography. Every little bit of support really help us keep running and help us keep education accessible. With that, I'll pass the mic along to Lynn, who will introduce our speaker today.
Yes, we are super duper duper excited to have Leo with us today. And it's my honor to read Leo's bio for you. And I always forget this. I'm going to say this up front. If you have any questions during Leo's talk, please feel free to pop them in the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to get to your question. With that out of the way, Leo Vicenti is an assistant professor of communication design at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. He holds an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in visual communication design and a BA in graphic design from Fort Lewis College. His current research approaches Indigenous language preservation, revitalization, and the return of these languages to everyday use through the development of language support in typography and representation in the design field. He maintains practice-based research in exhibition design alongside his creative pursuits in visual communication design. And we are super excited to have you with us, Leo. Thank you so much for being here. We'll let you take it away from us.
All right. Thanks, guys. Let me just get it set up really quick. Perfect. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for inviting me. I'm glad to participate, and I think it's a great thing for to offer for this series that you guys are putting on. I'm also a big mentioned this earlier. I'm a big fan of the type electives, so I want to at some point, right, be able to take one of the classes. So that's great. Yeah, and so for today, of course, I'm gonna share just a couple perspectives on Native American Indigenous languages. Um, I think the big warning here is that as we talk about like North American Indigenous languages, it's so vast, right? And so I think there's no way we can really touch on all of these perspectives. So I'm gonna touch on kind of like an introductory into kind of like spaces and working, and then also just show some of my own personal work that I've been kind of pushing along as a type designer, and maybe some of the educational perspectives too as well. Um, like Lynn had mentioned, I of course work as a professor of communication design. I did go through the Type West certification program through the Letterform Archive, so I have a lot of work that I've done in that, and I also just like to stay active too as well in the design practice. So alongside of teaching, I also try and have my own practice, and then I'm also trying to do other things on the side too as well that either need support or things that I just appreciate doing and enjoy doing. I wanted to start today by offering a land acknowledgement. And I can't see everyone here, but I uh I'm curious, how this is like a kind of like a mechanism for us. And in a couple of my classes, I actually use like a land acknowledgement as starting points for creativity and how to approach typography and type design. And so I think this is a good like starting point for us to start kind of like creating an awareness of where we're coming from and then also how we're coming to this place, right? So I'm not going to go through like performing this, but I think this as a creative space to start like designing and start understanding uh not only Native American, American Indian communities, but also, in larger in Canada, like where I'm at right now, First Nation, Aboriginal peoples, in both areas. We can also look at that like further south of the border too, as well. So Indigenous communities in Central and South America. So I think that awareness of where we're coming from, I think that for me was a big inspiration in terms of like uh, where I guess where I'm coming from in terms of understanding, but also how I process all of that and like some of the insights that I've been able to take as I go along in terms of like being an educator, but also being someone who teaches typography and someone who practices in type design. So some of the things that we're like looking here as we're looking at these like indigenous communities, what are they doing in terms of like representation in their language? Um, I'm originally from New Mexico, and New Mexico is a really diverse place. And so, even in terms of languages and indigenous communities, we have a lot of diversity in that area. So, as I was growing up, I had a sensitivity to that, but also just being around so much indigenous communities, it was something that was familiar to me, and I really appreciated that. I later went on to live in Chicago, and I think that was one of the things too, as well, of like developing that awareness of where I'm coming from and understanding like what are the local regional communities, right? And being able to connect with them. And so I wanted to see, people who had the same like background as me and like wanted some familiarity even as I travel around and move and stuff, and the same thing happened as coming into BC. So coming into BC, I had this urgency, uh this I wanted this bigger familiarity with where I was coming from. So I just wanted to share this First Peoples uh, Cultural Council. They had this map that was developed, and it's one of the things that a lot of people like cite this as kind of a reference for language. But what I really appreciate is just like it opened up my eyes to like all these different communities and these different languages. And so even though I do like more pointed like research, and I seek to collaborate with some of the host nations too as well. That going back to the land acknowledgement, creating that awareness of where I'm coming from, and then also the other communities that occupy this space. So as we look into even just these communities that I've mentioned of Musqueam and Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Semiahmoo, Catsi, Kwantlen, Sawathan, and Stalo, all of these, you know, I think about in terms of like both an awareness and a familiarity with the communities and the peoples, but also thinking about like the typographies, right? And so we can go through this in terms of looking at like certain characters, such as superscript characters. We can also look at this in terms of like the IPA, and a lot of these IPA characters also have roots in Greek characters as well. So those are some of the things that happen historically, we're here in the Pacific Northwest. We have a lot of those characters integrated into the orthographies up here. My my biggest and probably like an entryway for me into understanding this was primarily through these precomposed characters where we're adding like diacritics onto these uh, Latin characters. So either above or below those characters where we have diacritics that can attach into those different points. That was kind of like a gateway for me to kind of understand this work. But we can also highlight figures such as Squamish, who uses the seven as a glottal form, or punctuation and Stallo, where we're using that character for that. And then we have the Latin too as well. So we're working with this kind of like I guess like standardized approach, which is kind of somewhat phonetic in some ways. But getting more into the languages, I think there's a couple things as we're building out like this awareness and this kind of like practice, is that there's always instances of colonialisms and linguistic imperialism like happening in these areas. And so like I think about this in my own practice of like what are the influences of each of these, and then how does it apply to my practice? And so, even in the communities, every community is in a different place in their language journey. So we at some points, we want to have like these very hard and concrete answers in terms of like language data. Some communities aren't even in that place where they have a solidified orthography. Some communities might have several orthographies and they're working through which one is kind of working for them. And a lot of the times this happens with collaborations with linguists working with like technologists to develop like keyboards or other tools in the space. So I think that's something that as we get into the work, we gotta understand that what is our role in this place. Either as a type designer or a designer, or if I'm supporting a community, how do I do that? In terms of process, that's also a thing where like I mentioned, like we're not rushing into a specific way of working. I think that from things that I've seen, we're more looking at like respectful and responsible processes, but also processes that are community driven. And that being said, in terms of the community, every community has the right to control their language usage. And this is kind of a tough thing because I don't think a lot of people have been exposed to certain like cases where the community has a lot of control of their language. Up here in BC, I mentioned that the Musqueam Nation, which is one of the host nations outside of Vancouver, they actually have control of their language being published. So you don't actually have the right to use their language, and they have a whole process set up for that to actually be enabled. So I want to put those ideas out so that we know about them. And then in terms of like further control of language data, there's also this idea of data sovereignty where they have the power to dictate where that data is stored, how it's used, who has access to it. And so that data sovereignty is actually a really interesting and important concept in this whole kind of like working process. But as we go back to like the language, I feel like speaking is the most important, and a lot of questions have been directed to, well, what about typography is necessary for these communities to thrive, and I just want to note that typography is not really necessary. But what I think is really interesting is, can the written language be decolonized or indigenized? And so that's one thing that I kind of like ponder about in terms of like of my practice. And some of the explorations that I've done have actually been uh, kind of pointed at that, right? Like what is a decolonized like written language look like? Or what is, as we see like indigenization, what does that also look like in this space as well? A couple key insights that I wanted to share, knowing that we have these kind of like problem spaces. Um, the insights are really like coming from an indigenous point of view. And so touching on sovereignty, self-determination, reconciliation, and language reclamation. So sovereignty is most best understood in understanding it as an independent state. And the thing about sovereignty as it applies to typography and type design is that we assess these expressions conditionally on a case by case basis. And the reason I say that is because there's different communities, right? So if we go back to our host nations, each of those host nations can have a different approach. Like they're offered that power to dictate, right? Like how they want to express their sovereignty. And so we can actually have different communities taking different approaches on how they want to embrace sovereignty. Another case study that I want to share in terms of like the design space is this idea or concept of visual sovereignty, which is coined by Sadie Redwing, where she was primarily looking at like the visual representation and the semantic grounds in that. But I think how I'm looking at that is really in terms of a visual, image based approach of assessment, where I think if we're looking at like identity systems, right? There's a balance of visual and textual representation. So I think in this space, we're actually looking at, well, what is a textual representation, right? And what is a textual representation of sovereignty, and how is that kind of like parallel to these ideas of like image-based representations of visual sovereignty? But I think Sadie Redwing's work is definitely like a necessary to understand and to kind of like lead into this space. The second concept that we're looking at is self-determination. And self-determination is just generally the right to make decisions and control your path forward. So self-determination saying that we have the control of this, right? We have sovereignty, but we dictate how we're going to move forward with that sovereignty. And in terms of this work, in terms of like language programs and revitalization and typography, I want to just point out this case study of language nests, where language nests don't actually have any like written language in that approach. So going back to like the need for typography isn't really there. And language nests are one of the most successful approaches to language revitalization because they really embrace like an immersive model. But if you read more into that, you'll kind of see where some communities and most communities are kind of navigating revitalization efforts. The next one is reconciliation. And so I think this is really interesting. And I look at reconciliation in terms of like settlers, and it's a tough word to say, but I think that, a lot of the reconciliation needs to actually come from that point of view, right? Come from people who are, occupying land. And one of the things that I also run into is that like, a lot of people are like, well, how do I get started? Right? Where do I start? And so I've put together a list here of just like starting points and understanding what reconciliation is, and then also supporting that. So the first one is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Of course, it was published a while ago, and we're actually right now in terms of this duration of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So the start of next year is going to be the midpoint of that, and that would be a good, contemporary, like current push, a call to action for the need for more work in this space. In Canada, we also have the Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which they actually have calls to action that they've stated. And then in terms of communities can actually define in relation to in relation to language, right? So communities can have their own distinct efforts for reconciliation. And I think about this about, well, what about typography, right? What are they doing in terms of that? Where some communities might actually have efforts, right, to solidify an orthography or to have that work done to support revitalization efforts. And then the last one is self-defined. And I've talked about this, and I want you to look at this in terms of like indigenous and settler. And the reason that I separate those is because part of the reason that I want to offer these paths is because I want to know that I want people who are tuning in here to know that these are actually endorsed by communities and indigenous communities, and they're a way for us to get into the work that is really like has really pinpointed like what indigenous communities have needed in terms of reconciliation. I think that there might have been some misunderstandings or misinterpretations of self-defined reconciliation, where if you don't have any idea about these efforts, and you're just saying, I'm going to do this in terms of like my own like self-defined reconciliation, it might fall off the mark of like making an impact, right, in terms of supporting this work. So yeah, those are a couple things. And then the last one is language reclamation. And so most simply like empowerment for the reclamation of language, culture, identity, and sovereignty. And I think this is really one of the most important too as well, especially as like an indigenous type designer myself, is being empowered, right, to make an impact, to reclaim. And so I think in a lot of ways we need to be able to take the reins, right, and be able to control and influence the spaces that these things are happening. And in terms of like typography, right, like being able to make some impact in that space. As an educator, I feel like I'm able to do that some, and as a type designer, I feel like I'm able to control some of that. But I think these pushes for reclamation are kind of necessary in the systems that kind of like control the spaces, right? Like softwares and encoding. Those are kind of spaces that I'm looking at in terms of reclamation, and how can we influence that, and how can we support different pushes to maybe not control, but to empower us, right? To empower us to support our communities going forward. So yeah, the indigenous typographies is just really like showing my path into this space. I started doing a lot of like lettering, and a lot of this was really like research based, where I was looking into a lot of type specimens. I was looking at a lot of older styles and putting together concepts, but also in this whole process and throughout all of this work, I'm also like a language learner myself. So how do I support my own language learning? And then also, being comfortable and understanding orthographies and that whole process, working with communities, but also like working as a type designer too as well. So a lot of that, it kind of led to where I'm at right now. One of the first like breakthroughs, like conceptually for me, was really looking at our orthography for our community, and what I was hoping to do is to simplify it. And so we had these character groupings, which are called digraphs and trigraphs in linguistics, where they're pairings of different characters, right? So if we look in here, you can see pairings of two and three different like characters or elements, and this kind of like design was just an effort for me to say, well, hey, can I? Is there a way for me to like kind of hack this? Is there a way for me to simplify it? Is there that capability or that flexibility for me to think of another system, right, that would work for us, that's more simplified and it's not so hard to understand and hard to take on. So I really thought that this was kind of like a breakthrough for me in terms of like understanding the orthography. And it just led to other work too as well. And so one of my first classes that I took in type design was actually with Juan at the Type at Cooper. We had the display class. And I thought that this was a great opportunity just for me to get into type design because I had a really big passion for it, but also I think it was very applicable. And this first project that I did, which is entitled Da Maza, it was really just a way to kind of like change my external environment and being able to kind of immerse myself right in the language and immerse other people in the language and see through that process, would we be able to actually learn language? Like if we changed our environment, would I be able to kind of like learn? Would I pull from that? And so Danaza, which if we're looking at the actual character forms, stylistically, it's on kind of like symmetrical, a modular symmetrical kind of like character. And so if I'm looking at this is actually more condensed. And the reason that I took that approach is because in Hikaria we have these very long sentences that are very descriptive, and so to afford that, the typeface had to have kind of like a condensed character, and also to fit into these signs where even for like this, if I wanted to have a larger word, it would actually condense the type design quite a bit too as well. So in this character set, you can see that I have those pre-composed characters that I was mentioning, and so like I said, the diacritics that occur above the character, and then the diacritics that occur below the character. So part of this research and this work was actually me looking into and understanding Unicode. So the top line where we're looking at the character O and the one that we have on our keyboard, and then having a combining character for an acute, and then adding that to a micron below, that would equal, right? So we have these options of going that way. In Unicode, we also have these precomposed characters, which is the one on the bottom in the green. So it can also take the place of the blue characters. So in the encoding, I had to learn that there's these different paths of creating the same character, and as a type designer, I also had to know like, well, how did that work out, right? Like, what did I do? Because within all of this, I had to make a choice of like, well, how do I go about it in terms of encoding and pushing this project forward so that it worked and was practically applicable. The other thing too was that some of these diacritics and some of these code points, they also needed to be kind of like navigated as well. The line below, the macron below, minus sign below, combining and non-combining marks. Those were things that I had to kind of like navigate. And there's different ways and different approaches for each of them. For example, like the combining micron below, which is the one that I use currently, and I started off using. It's most accessible, right? But the thing is that it doesn't actually connect, and so you'll see a line underneath the character. And if I had two characters after another, say an A and a B that used it, that line in between them wouldn't connect. So if I want that connecting line, like an underline, that's most used in the combining low line, the U0332. So if I want them to connect in terms of an underline, I'll be using that. And I had to actually, think to myself, well, why would I use this over that? And knowing the differences between those applications, and then also how to encode them and to utilize them in the type design. But I think the actual work came out really nice. It's a very simple design, and these signs are actually ones that I'm actually pulling from my community. So these are just kind of replications or duplications of what I've already seen. And this is what I was talking about in terms of like the length of the content, where I can have characters that are or sentences that are quite long. The type design had to kind of afford that, and being able to condense all of those characters into some um, you know, layout of that sort. But I had a lot of fun in doing that work. Like I mentioned, I did go into Type West, and so one of the first projects I took on was this project I called entitled Beshi, which is a revival of Aldrich Menhart's Parliament typeface. And so I thought this was really interesting because Menhart actually had a lot of um, exploration and development of Czech diacritics and accents. And so I found that really inspiring, and it helped me really understand the space a lot better. And this particular project, I thought it was very close to me in terms of like the conceptual grounds too, where this typeface, which is no longer available because they actually melted down the type after it was printed, but it was used to print the Czech Constitution. And so I felt that the conceptual grounds really paralleled my values in indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. And that was very applicable for me at the time. And so going through and being able to work on this project, it was really great. And it was just enjoyable being able to take on and come up with a project that was more uh, it was bigger, right? It's bigger than a typeface. I had to do more an expanded character set on this one, and so I really appreciated that. And then there was things like this where I could really take it for my own and being able to kind of like fit it to my community and how I envision that coming into play here in this mock-up of the dictionary for our community. And then the last project that I did for Type West is this project Goni. So it was a Clarendon style, humanist leaning Roman typeface. I thought that this was really like fitting for me coming from the Southwest, where we had these kind of representations of like Western, right, styles. And uh, I think it was just something I was working for, and I'm still working on this to a degree. One of the things that I felt was the most enjoyable for me was actually taking what would be like the display uh, approach to this and being able to turn that into a stencil. And so I felt that that was really necessary for these kind of like efforts or uses for self-determination and sovereignty, but also being able to look at like protests, and which is very often historically that we've had to go through those, and something like a stencil typeface could support movements like that. I think it would support protests, and so I really appreciated that. And I actually, one of the things I'm very active on is just social media and being able to like share some of these projects. And so the utilitarian part of it, where I can actually use it and I can test it and I enjoy it, but I'm also, I developed this work. So it's really interesting. And then, like I mentioned, things like these where I can actually envision them and bring them to life. That was really enjoyable for me. I still do type design, and this is one of the ones that I have in the works right now. But I think still conceptually those grounds are still part of it for me. And so thinking of uh, which ones am I going to put my efforts toward, and then why would I choose something like this, right? And how could I use this? So those are some of the things that I think about. Um, because I haven't like officially started my foundry yet, which I do have plans of releasing some in the future. Uh, some of the efforts that I do are actually geared towards like my educational position. So this is a type design that I designed a while ago. I think like 3 or so years ago now, which I titled this anew. It could also be pronounced like Anoia, if you're familiar with that kind of like you know transliteration. But I think it was really fitting for me because I had to teach some of my students about like representation in terms of representing Indigenous communities. And so what a lot of the things and the workshop that I take students through is actually just looking up Indigenous typography on the internet and finding what you see, right? What do you find when you look up that term? And there was a lot of just generalization, right? And you see a lot of these geometric forms that fall into that. And so we have that discussion of like, well, how does that represent a people? How does that represent a community when all of these forms are really generalized, right? And is that something that's fitting for a living community, right? Like, well, how would I feel as an Indigenous person being represented by this typeface, right? Would it really represent me, or is it something that really more generalizes where I'm coming from? And right, I think going back to Sadie in terms of like visual sovereignty, where we're looking at like visual representations, right? Like how is that something that how does the visual culture influence my approach to type design? And so I think those are interesting questions to ask. And also, yeah, like this isn't something that I'm like selling, right? But it's something that's more of an educational tool for us to kind of like learn about representation in typography. This statement says a type design that meets the demand for ultra modern style and typography. So I think it's different bits like that where I'm able to kind of like play with language, but it's also, yeah, it's a very real dynamic that we're navigating. But there's also things that are, it's a practice, right? So I think part of this is me also navigating that space, right? And compositions like these, they help me to still have fun with the work. I think we're growing up in a weird time, and so and students are too as well. So I think it has to in some ways kind of reflect that. So the last couple points is just like supporting going forward. And support can be like in terms of like equity in institutions or organizations. It can be financial support or different projects, simple respect and responsibilities, right? In terms of like, we mentioned land acknowledgements, fostering relations is really helpful, right? Like how are we adopting of different perspectives and developing those relations with our host nations, some more supporting Indigenous community efforts in terms of what they're trying to do with their language supports, and then also just supporting like Indigenous practitioners, right? Like I'm in a typographic like academic space. There might be someone in like media and technology who are doing like really interesting stuff too as well. I think just the general support can be really great for the communities across the country. And then in terms of like Indigenous peoples, I think just the supporting of the strengthening, right? For Indigenous peoples to have an active practice, to be able to give the time and the efforts to do the work, and then just needing people, not only Indigenous people, but people at all level. I think in order for things to happen, we need a lot of support, and we need a lot of people to support that. So the strengthening of that can come on both ends. And that's all. Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much, Leo. This is
Yeah,
all
thank you so
so
much.
rich and so informative and trying to digest everything. And for
Yeah,
folks listening into the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A function or the webinar chat, and we'll try to get to you. I mean,
yeah,
okay, well, first of all, to start off the Q&A section, Leo, it seems like there's like so much you've done already, and there's all like so much to be done in the future as well. Like, what's like next for you? Like, out of all the things that you've pointed out, like that, like needs to get done, like community needs to go towards and evolve. Like, what do you see as like the near term goal for you, or like a wish list, if you will?
Oh, well, I think like everything, I think it all and I think for me, like there needs to be more people because we need more help. Like I can't do everything. So I think it's really fitting that I'm in education and educating people about this. Because once people know about it, then we can have more support and more impact as we go forward. I think I do collaborate with a couple of the host nations here up in Vancouver. A lot of that is just like, how can I support you? What can we do as a school to support your language program? Can we work together? Is there something that can happen, right? Where that I can support them, or you know, even what do they want to do? I think those are good questions, is because every community is different. I think for me personally, my role is to be an educator and to line out this stuff. I think, like I said, like if someone didn't have a good grasp of this environment and they're trying to do the work, that's good, but there kind of has to be like an indigenous person like taking the lead. It's kind of similar, like if I wanted to say like the United States wanted to, right, like take on like indigenous, decolonization or whatever. Um, if it's just a bunch of like, settlers, like they're not going to understand like what's needed. And so it becomes like wasted effort if the indigenous people aren't like lining it out and spelling it for what we want and how we want that to be like approached. So I think there is a role, and the unfortunate thing is that, it puts a burden on indigenous peoples, because like if we look at it across the map, there's only a handful of indigenous peoples like holding roles in academia, and the same can be said for like government in the United States. So it's unfortunate that we have to do all the work, but I take it on because it's like it is necessary, right? We need this work. We need people to know about it, and we need people to follow too and support this work. So I think those are like beginning points for my role. I still also think that in the typographic space, I need to be a practitioner. I need to, some of the works that I'm doing, like the concepts and these kind of like case study works, like even though they're not available, people need to kind of like see how that affects and influences like a typographic practice, a type design practice, and yeah, and it's tough too as well. Like, there's so little representation in the type design space. I think there's what Chris is in here, Chris Skillern. Uh, we have Noah Lee, right? Jessica is in there. Like
We're like
we only have,
50% here.
yeah. So we only have
That needs
like
to
a
change.
couple, we only have a couple like people working in this space. So being able to kind of like develop those perspectives, right? Like to be able to do the work and to actually practice and to feel how that's affecting us and influencing us. I think that's really important too as well. And so even though there's a small amount of us, we still need to be able to do the work and to work through those problems and those challenges.
Thank you so much, Leo. We have a question in the Q&A, and folks, please send us your questions. We have like 13 minutes left, so want to make sure we get to everyone. So the question is, first of all, it says, great talk. What emerging projects or technologies excite you in the field of Indigenous typography right now?
Oh, thanks, Genevieve. Yeah, I mean, I'm getting into like keyboards right now. I think that's really exciting for me. I like that there's development in that space. I think that yeah, because we're talking about typography, but these are input devices, input tools, right? To input content and into the digital space. I think those are good for us to, if we're making grounds in terms of controlling, being able to control that and being able to develop those technologies ourselves. I think that's really important. I also think that, and I've talked to Juan about this too, about encoding, about like you know, what are we able to do in that space, right? What control or what influence can we have in terms of encoding? And I didn't touch on it much, but there is a flexibility, there is a fluidity to orthographies. And I use my own community as an example because we've had different orthographies over the years of our program growing. So I think there is a flexibility to orthographies, and I feel like encoding isn't that flexible. So how do where's the give, right? And so I think in terms of like keyboards and in terms of encoding, I think those are really interesting spaces to kind of like enter after understanding like the surface level, right, of like orthographies and typographies and alphabets and that stuff. So that really excites me, but the more you go into it, it's kind of boring, but I think it's exciting.
You're totally right. I think it's typography and technology go hand in hand because you need something to render the shapes. I don't see any more questions. So folks, please add them there. I do have a question because I love everything you presented. It's very thoughtfully presented, as always. And anyway, we have a lot of conversations between you and me. You bring out a lot of interesting things that, I totally agree. But I feel like some folks who might not be so into the idea of decolonization might find provocative. Especially, I think, when you say typography is not necessary to me like spins my wheels and like, oh yeah, well, other ways in which we could like think about this issue or this topic, and kind of like bring in different perspectives, especially for folks who haven't considered how typography is tied to colonization, resistance, and also sovereignty. It has a big role in that. So I guess my question is kind of like your follow-up point on that particular slide is like, do you think that written language can be decolonized? Or how are some ways you think about it in that sense? And if you have a practical way, if not, it's just your thoughts on it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be decolonized, and in Canada we have, the United Canadian Syllabics too, right? Syllabics. I think those are like avenues for communities up north to actually kind of lead further away from the Latin kind of approach. I think that those give paths for communities to give a more indigenous like look and feel in terms of how their language is represented. And then some of the works, I mentioned the first project that I did, which is more of like a ligature approach to type design. Those were kind of like efforts in that of like, can I go further away from the Latin character set, or do I have this ability to take it my own direction, right? As an indigenous person from this community, I think those are like starting points for us to kind of like lead further away, and to once you understand the system, being able to make those changes and improvise, right? Improvise different ways of going forward that lean further away from like a Latin approach. I've also thought about this in terms of like, these other like script spaces. Like I think when I first started, I thought, and this might be directed at Chris Skillern, but I thought when I first was learning about like Cherokee, like this is like I was like, oh, like this is resolved, right? Like you guys are like there's nothing like you guys have everything like fixed. Like you guys don't have any like there's no openness to this. Like you've kind of resolved all of this already. And for me, that was an assumption. And the more I got familiar with and studied Cherokee, and learning a lot from Chris too as well. That's one of the things where there's still change going on, right? Like he outlines the older texts and how they change to more contemporary, and then even in the contemporary how they change. And so I think that's really the fluidity of the orthography and the dynamicism of the language, how it can still afford that change, right? And even in his most recent talk, he outlines how, there's still like as you look into italics, right? Like Cherokee italics, like there's changes that he's making, and I just love it because it shows that exact thing that I'm actually getting towards of like, yes, like we can reclaim this space and take control of it and how it develops going forward. We have that power. And yeah, it's a case by case basis, but I think it's possible. And when I see it happening, it's fulfilling, right? It's fulfilling to say like, oh yes, like it is right. It is possible. Like we can do that, and it might be incremental, but I think the more, like I said, in terms of reclamation, the more power that we have to create those systems or to make those choices, that's the power that's needed to make those changes. So I think it becomes very important for us, like indigenous type designers or people who are coming from a place of, indigenous communities or, disadvantaged language communities to have that power to kind of develop that and to make those choices. I think that's really big. And it puts a lot of control in our spaces, which should feel good. We can, if that's our vision, is to decolonize, uh we also have that power to indigenize, right? To even go even further away from because decolonization is still tied to colonization, but indigenization can be something that's like totally new, right? It can be something totally new, right? So I think that's really exciting for me, and I hope other people embrace it too. I've tried to, I'm working on it, and it's possible, right? Like Chris shows us, like I like some of the work shows us that there is a possibility out there.
Yeah, I think we have a question that is like very tied to what you're thinking about right now. Genevieve asked if you have any wishes or hopes for how Indigenous typography could appear or be experienced in the built environment. So maybe that's a good question while we're on this note of possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I want, like my project, Danaza, like I want our environments to be reflections of our communities. If we have indigenous communities, like really diverse and rich communities, like here in BC, I want to see that reflected in the environment. I want companies, I want institutions, I want organizations to adopt those efforts. And signage is a good example. And Genevieve is, that's a good like crossing point where if we change all the signage, right, like how would that change our environments? How would we look at a place different, right? If a museum, or if a school, or even like a business, right? Like what would Starbucks look like? Like embracing like Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh like orthographies. Like I think those are ways for us to embrace like our local like indigenous communities and cultures.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I also like to think about how like sign painting can be a way for people to be, more expressive in their own ways as opposed to using fonts and vinyl, because that gives it a more quote unquote local flavor sometimes. Um,
Oh yeah, definitely. Mhm.
and I think I asked this to Chris Killer, like was there like sign painters in Cherokee, and I think there weren't that many, but it would be cool to see that like done as a sign painter in a signage. Uh, Anyway, we have one last question, I think. So this question is, how do you balance the self-determination that might come with a language having its own script with the accessibility to access typefaces that support your language, though it might be Latin or Greek based? Interesting question.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just reading this. Just give me one
Yeah,
second.
no, go for it. It's a little bit of a technical question, but
Yeah. So self-determination is like a community, right? It's a community concept. So self-determination is really embraced by the community. So the community, it makes those decisions, right? So if they have their own script space and they're developing their own typefaces, it's going to be their decision whether they want it to be Latin or Greek or phonetic or syllabic based. But they like, I think in terms of like type design, uh, it's part of the role and the responsibility of the type designer to lay out those choices. And a lot of the times, a linguist will come in and say the same too as well, because the linguist is looking at like um, uh, the system, right? The system of the language. And so there's going to be the like I mentioned with the micron below, the line below, right? You have all these options of how to encode it, and part of that is like it's part linguistic, it's part like type design, right? You have to know the encoding, but you also have to know how it's practically applicable in terms of like the system of language. So the self-determination, going back to it, it's like the whatever the community wants, that's what should happen, right? If the community wants to have their own script space and they want to develop something, they should be able to. And I think this brings in that idea of like encoding, of like how flexible is Unicode, or if they even want to stay with Unicode, right? Like I think I mentioned this with uh, our other brother, Chris Hernandez, right? Like uh, there's the what is it, Lachute Seed, right? The Lachute Seed font that was developed by Juliet Shen. That's a very beautiful typeface, but it's not like Unicode compliant, right? And they knew that going into that typeface, that they didn't want that compliance. And so you can work within the system or you can work outside of the system, but essentially like whatever the community wants and where they want to go with this is really up to them. And then the role of the linguists has to be supportive of that self-determination, but also the role of the type designer has to be supportive of that self-determination as well. And part of that is also being an educator and saying, hey, like, right, like these are the options, and lining out those options and saying like you have, all of these as available options. Like I mentioned before with the micron below, like that's one of the most supported like digitally. So that's one of the pros of using that. The other one could be the low line, right? And so but those are two different approaches. So it has to be kind of like educationally on how you line that out for them as a type designer, but there might be other influences like that come into play because like we said with like IPA or Latin or syllabics, there's there's still a lot of development that needs to happen in each of those places, I feel. And yeah, it's we're still seeing Kevin King, uh we're still seeing what do you call it, Unicode proposals, right, for encoding changes. So I don't foresee that hindering, or not hindering, but I don't see that stopping in the near future. I think that there's still going to be changes, and that flexibility of the language is still going to happen, and there's still going to be community preferences too as well along with that. So we kind of have to be able to navigate that and understand that as part of the dynamic of the space.
Thank you so much, Leo. And I selfishly have one last question that I want to ask. And as an educator, um, I think there are a lot of educators, including myself, and I'll be vulnerable here, who obviously live on occupied land, and like we want to do more than like just acknowledging that we like exist on stolen land, and we want like our students in the classroom environment to engage meaningfully with like where we are. But there is a lot of insecurity that comes with like obviously not being Indigenous, and often not having an Indigenous person in the classroom or even the building with us. Like, do you have any advice for educators who want to incorporate that respect and support without it becoming like this like one slide at the start of each lecture and just like moving past it, like, and it being meaningless. Like, do you have any advice for folks who are specifically educators in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think the land acknowledgement is a good like starting point, but it has to be like uh it has to be action based. You know, it has to be something like you got to be doing something to help. It doesn't help to be like performative, and it's tough because I know some places across the states, you know, right? Like they don't have as much of a community presence. But I still think we still have a responsibility, right, to acknowledge that of like, you know, there's a lot of things bad that have happened across the states. Um, but we still have a responsibility to acknowledge that yes, this has happened, and this is what we're trying to do going forward, right? Like we can outline things. There's different organizations that we can support. We can ask our government to do better as well, right? Like we have regional governments that can better acknowledge and work with communities and support communities. Schools and institutions can also do better, right? And I think that's where we see a lot of the land acknowledgements happening and popping up is in like educational institutions. So if you're not aware, you know, it might be something that you see and you look to what is your local institution doing, and how does that something that or what is your local government doing to get kind of like a handle on how to start approaching it, how to get familiar with the local communities in your region, and then also like in a particular like practice space too. Like I know that, you know, we mentioned a couple like you know, I mentioned Chris Skillern, we mentioned Noah, mentioned Jessica. Chris, I know Chris is a great, you know, type designer as well. We had another one, is it Joy in the chat? Like I think just supporting practitioners is also a way in, right? Like I think we sometimes might not know where to start, and sometimes it just comes in like supporting people, right? Supporting what they're doing. And you know, as an educator, it's tough because I feel like to like line out things. Um, and a lot of it has to be like educationally driven, but some people they're just like practicing and they don't know, like they're still navigating that space. So it's good not to put any unnecessary like pressure on anyone of like you need to give me the answers, right? Of like how do I do this, where maybe they haven't figured it out as well, you know, and it's still something that we're working through, and it might, you know, going back to the presentation, it might be something that we still work on for, you know, a couple decades to come until we really can figure it out. But I think we've made a lot of grounds, and I think, yeah, I've also put, you know, in the presentation, I think those calls for reconciliation, I think those are good like starting points too as well. Even though we're not, you know, I'm coming from like more of a Canadian perspective. What can we learn from Canada, right? Like what can we learn from them, and how are they handling stuff? What is that history or histories that we're not as familiar to being like south of the border in the States? So we can also look further like south into, right, like Central and South America too as well. So I think that this educational kind of like approach is really helpful to um, you know, develop some familiarity and to find those starting points, right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Leo. I mean, um I love your approach to like decolonization and education and like all like all the big topics in a way where like you are like letting us know like what are things that we can individually do and think about and be respectful about, as well as like thinking about like how a lot of this is not just like typography. Like there's, you know, there's like the whole world that society and our lives are built on that have like so many things, you know, and typography is like just a very, very small portion of it. And we really need to like fight for, um, you know, like improving all of this, not just like the letters. Yeah.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, like it's tough because I mean it's such a, typography is so simple, right? But we forget, I think a lot of people forgets and uh a lot of these orthographies they're people, right? They're communities. And I think that we forget that sometimes as type designers. We're just like, oh, well, like I can just add all these characters and glyphs in my software, but we got to remember that we are representing people, we are representing communities, and like I said, like there's a lot that goes into that. We um, you know, can't be complacent in our work. We have to be very critical in our work.
Right, like not having like enough indigenous like typographers is just like a symptom of like the problem that like the world has, you
Mhm.
know. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Leo. Like this, I mean, like your entire lecture and all the advice that you're giving us, like, and you're like the way that you view like the world in such like a critical eye, as well as like having so much optimism and drive and motivation, is very inspiring to us, and I'm sure it is for everyone on the webinar as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you so
thank you.
much,
Thank you
Leo.
so much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll upload the recording when it's ready, but have everyone have a great good morning, good afternoon, good evening. See you
Thank
next
you so
time.
much.
Yeah, thanks, guys. See you.
Thank you.
Have a
See
good
ya.
one.